A todos. Vamos dar início à conferência de Imko. Imko está treinando seu inglês e seu espanhol, e por isso justamente está el sabático com nós em esse semestre aqui no Instituto. Por isso a conferência será em inglês, mas estamos seguros que para maio vai ser capaz de dar sua conferência em espanhol. Pero por ahorita vamos con el inglés. Entonces, permítanme presentarles de manera un poquitín más formal la semblanza de Imko, ¿no? Imko Meyenburg completó sus estudios de licenciatura en Oldenburg, Alemania, realizó su maestría en negocios en la Universidad Tecnológica de Auckland, New Zealand, y obtuvo el grado de doctor en Economía y Filosofía de la Economía en la Universidad de Anglia Ruskin, Reino Unido, de la cual es actualmente profesor titular de Economía y Negocios Internacionales. Sus investigaciones se concentran en la filosofía de la economía, con especial atención al pluralismo, ontología y epistemología, y una de sus publicaciones más recientes es titulada Opciones bajo el pluralismo epistémico en economía. También tenemos el gusto y el honor de que Josafat, quien está a mi izquierda, se animara a preparar un comentario a la conferencia. Y entonces permítame también de una vez aprovechar para presentar a nuestro comentarista. Josafat Hernández concluyó su licenciatura en Economía en la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM, aquí en la casa, y tiene una especialización en Historia del Pensamiento Económico. Obtuvo su maestría en Filosofía de la Ciencia por el programa de posgrado en Filosofía de la Ciencia de la UNAM y el doctorado por ese mismo programa, ¿verdad? Además de ser interesados en esos temas de modelos e idealizaciones de la gente racional y su historia en el concepto y en el pensamiento económico y la dimensión social de la heurística, participó de distintas publicaciones colectivas y además de trabajos individuales publicados. Y actualmente es postdoctorante en el C3, que es ese centro que no muchos de nosotros conocemos, y también aprovechamos a Josafat que nos explique qué es el C3 de la UNAM cuando tome la palabra, ¿no? Sin más, entonces la dinámica será Imko tendrá 50 minutos para su exposición, luego Josafat tendrá 20 minutos, hasta 20 minutos para sus comentarios, y finalmente abrimos a una ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Antes ya de finalmente darle la palabra a Imko, déjame decirles que lo que yo más aprecio en la labor de Imko es su capacidad didáctica. Tiene una capacidad didáctica y hacernos adentrar en temas densos de una manera muy amigable, como ustedes tendrán oportunidad de ver a continuación y dar testigo de que no miento, ¿no? Entonces, sin más, Imko, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. Thank you for being here with us at the Institute. We are really glad of having you here. So this is your home until next June. So please, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming, and thank you for the invitation. And so I'm going to talk about everything today. I try to keep it very intuitive for you guys, so you kind of get a feeling of what I'm trying to say without going into like real detail and so on and so forth. So what's the plan for today? So I'm going to talk a bit about the nature of social reality, which is the aim of social ontology in general. I'm coming specifically from the so-called Cambridge Social Ontology Group in Cambridge, UK, not the fake one in the US. So that's like a group of people who come together every week, and we talk about everything social ontology thingy-wise, and people come back and write papers about this. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from and so on. So I just want to give you a feeling of what we talk about and what social ontology is about, and then I go into my two papers which I'm working on at the moment as part of my sabbatical. One is about vagueness in social ontology, and the other one is on ontological pluralism. Monika already introduced me, who I am, so I'm living in England, kind of like passionate about philosophy and everything, and that picture is from last year. It was the last time I presented at a conference on the same topic, on social ontology, and that was, everybody was absolutely happy with that because the room was empty. So yeah, I'm quite happy that you actually came, so I don't have to talk to an empty room again. Okay, so let's get started. So what is the nature of social reality? And I'm basically taking everything out of this particular book by Tony Lawson, who is also very much responsible in leading the Cambridge Social Ontology Group in England. And he recently published his book last year, The Nature of Social Reality, Issues in Social Ontology, which is basically basically everything he's been working on for the past 200 years. Okay, so ontology traditionally is understood as the science of study of being. Right? Sounds very complicated, but we're interested in what is actually what does exist and so on. We do have two differentiations here. One is philosophical ontology, which is all about the study of what exists and how it exists. So that is kind of like the main bits and pieces we do in social ontology in the group, and then the scientific ontology is a bit what is it? How do existence exists? And my two papers are more into scientific ontology rather than social ontology. So I'm not so much interested in what exists, but I'm more interested in how do things exist and what do we actually do when we do social ontology. So it's a bit of a meta position. It's like talk about methodology. So instead of sitting down and getting some data and throw it into a model where you do that's doing econometrics. If you step back, you can talk about whether or not it makes sense to use that particular type of methodology in all contexts. So I basically do the same in terms of ontology. And then obviously what we look at is what we call the social domain, which we define as all set of phenomena whose existence necessarily depends, at least in part, on human beings and their interactions. Right? So we are slightly naturalist in the sense that we are interested in all the phenomena which are dependent in their existence on our interactions as human beings. Right? So we're not really interested in the existence of planets, although we sometimes talk about them, and black holes, and stones, and mountains, and so on. We just say they do exist, but they are happily exist whether or not human beings are there or not. Right? So that's kind of like the bit naturalist conception here, or the critical realist conception. And what we're particularly interested in terms of social ontology, which relates to social sciences and economics, is to look at the whole question about what depends on our existence. Right? So that's kind of the playing field we look at, and I'll give you some more examples later on. Okay, so why should we care? In the first place, because that's always the question I get first, why should we care? Which is also the worst question ever. Why should we care about the stuff you're doing? So first of all, ontological theorizing in economics has a history. It's historically been widely recognized in practice. It has disappeared in contemporary economics. Especially mainstream economics. But if you look, for example, at Marx's Capital, the first chapter is all about the nature of the commodity. That is pure ontology. What is the nature of a commodity? what is that thing actually we look at? So that's ontology. Thorstein Veblen's idea about considering economics to be an evolutionary science rather than anything else. And obviously John Maynard Keynes' treatise on the nature of probability. It's a brilliant piece of work where he talks about what is probability actually, and does the conception of probability in contemporary economics actually display what probability is? And he also talks about uncertainty and so on, right? So these are all ontological pieces of work. So it's been there, it's been around, and you may have already read one or two of these things, maybe not, I don't know. If not, you should do, it's quite interesting. So that's already been there. Secondly, for those of you who are interested in it, you can use social ontology to create a critique of contemporary economics. So again, one example is Keynes warning about the ontological commitments of econometric techniques. What do you actually need to consider what human beings are in order for these models to work? The isolated atom who is perfect knowledge about everything, and that kind of things. And Keynes already said, that's not really how things work and how people are. So, but in order for you to get your models properly run, you need certain ontological assumptions about what the nature of human beings are, for instance, and interactions and institutions, all these things, right? And then one thing is about Ronald Coe's paper about the nature of the firm, which talks about mostly, transaction costs and everything, but actually doesn't really talk about what a firm really is. The ontology of the firm really is. So, you can kind of create a critique out of it. Thirdly, with any phenomena of interest, understanding its nature is essential, or essential properties allow us to relate and interact with it in a more knowledgeable way. So again, that sounds a bit complicated, but essentially all of you are already social ontologists, right? How? Well, you know exactly the nature of things you constantly interact with, right? You know the nature of this building, and you know that you need to use the door in order to get in. You can't walk through the walls, right? So the nature of this building itself tells you how you can interact with it. And understanding that particular nature obviously allows you to get into the room. So that's like the physical structure. Obviously we're a bit more interested in more complex things like the interactions between human beings. How do you interact with certain people? How do you interact with your professors versus how you interact with your friends? And you have that knowledge, so you interact according to your knowledge about the nature of these relationships, for instance, you have with these people. So, and the same argument is done with regards to research. A proper understanding or better understanding or theorizing of the nature of the social reality in total will allow you to interact better with it, will allow you to construct better models maybe, and do proper, better research. So Tony always says, and you have different tools at your disposal. Imagine you want to put a nail into the wall. What you need is a hammer, right? So that's the best tool, because you know the nature of the wall and the nature of the nail. You can use the appropriate tool to interact with that and achieve what you want. If you want to go out and cut your grass in your garden, if you have one, then obviously the hammer doesn't really work, right? So knowing about the nature of the phenomena you look at allows you to develop tools. That's what we do in terms of research, in order to properly investigate this stuff. And finally, I think the exercise of sustained critical reasoning is damn fun. and a satisfying thing to do, right? I mean, we are at university for a reason. I mean, some of you might just want to get a degree, to get a good job at the end of the day, but, if you're an old school academic like me, just having fun and thinking all day long. So that's kind of like the reasons why you should care. Okay, so particularly focused on, or the focus of the Cambridge group, the main theory is called social positioning. There are obviously other theories out there, but we work with social positioning, and it's kind of like defined in the following, that all social reality is constituted through the process of social positioning, whereby people and things, like tables, are incorporated as components of social systems or totalities, right? So this seminar right now is a totality, and you and I are incorporated. Me as a speaker, I am positioned as a speaker, and you are positioned as the listeners or seminar attendees, so to say, right? And then obviously this seminar itself is positioned within a wider totality of this institute, right? So, and then, this institute is incorporated in the wider totality of the university, and so on and so forth, right? So, and this is all through social positioning, right? So there you created the position of the seminar speaker, it exists, and I'm the one who's being positioned into this right now, right? Bless you. And I can leave at the end of my talk. I'll leave this position, and whatever happens. And obviously, I can hold several different positions at the same time. So right now I'm seminar speaker, but I'm also positioned as lecturer at my university. I'm positioned as son of my parents. And so on and so forth. Depending on the social context we look at, there are different positions you occupy at the same time. The same thing with things. This thing was constructed in order to be positioned as a table in the seminar room. Okay. Social totalities that include position human beings are components. We call these totalities communities, and mostly the components serve a so-called system function, so the whole community can actually work and function the way it does, right? So I am positioned as a speaker at the moment because I have the capacities to talk to you. So I fulfill the system function of this particular seminar, and you do as well, because you are here, you sit and you listen. So I could have been wrongly positioned. It's also possible. I could have been positioned in a room. I mean, I'm positioned in a room, but luckily you are so kind to allow me to speak in English. If you would not understand it, I would be very much wrongly positioned here, because I wouldn't be able to speak in Spanish, and therefore I would not serve the system function of that particular seminar, right? So, just as a side note, we have been arguing quite a lot whether or not Donald Trump is, properly positioned as president or not. Does he actually fully serve the system function of the presidency in the US or not? Which has been a long debate so far. Okay, so social positioning is all about you take components, you position them, and they usually are also get so-called rights and obligations. So I have the right to speak today to you. You have the right, you have the matching obligation to listen, and I also have the obligation to speak at least in English. Because you have the right to understand me. If I would switch to German, the whole thing would, completely collapse. Okay, so this kind of like seminar situation is an example of social positioning. You have someone positioned as speaker, some people listening, and so on and so forth. And there is a rights obligation relationship between us. And this is kind of like how, so that's kind of like the essence of social ontology, right? We look at this, and obviously this is a very simplified example. You know, when we really talk about things, obviously it's about the relationship between people in like institutions. You know, what sort of, you know, how does this whole thing work when you look at, you know, like an institution like this university, for instance, which has, I understand, quite a lot of people running around here, interacting with each other all the time. You know, how do these things actually work? How do they stay stable? You know, what is actually going on when we talk about you know, potential inequalities or discrimination and so on? How do these positions work with regards to these things, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's kind of like the basics, I think. If there are any questions later, we can go through it. And for those, obviously, one particular work Toledo also does is to talk about the nature of money in that sense, you know, because as economists we're kind of like interested in money for some reason, and but you know, money is just kind of like there, and the question is obviously what is the nature of money itself, you know, and so that's something to talk about in detail. Okay, so now we come on to my paper, so that's covered the outlining. You know, we do ontological theorizing and so on and so forth, and I've been working on 2 papers which takes a step back and looks at, you know, what are we actually doing, what's going on when we start to talk about ontology. And one of them, the first one, is about vagueness and social ontology, and which I've been working on together with a former undergraduate student of mine. So Anna used to be a student of mine, and we worked together on that paper. Because publication takes always a bit longer, she graduated already and found like a proper job and a good life.
She's a PhD now.
Not yet. I tried to convince her to come back and do a master's and PhD, but you know, she's earning quite a lot of money in a banking position in London. So you know, it's hard to convince someone if you actually earn a lot of money come back, but I'm still fighting. So yeah, but yeah. So Anna came on board one point and worked on it with me. And the second one is about the question of ontological pluralism. So let's start with the first one, vagueness. So vagueness is a term which comes from analytic philosophy, and we have defined it as follows. So it's a matter of indeterminacy, in inquiry-resistant borderline cases that, according to us at least, pose non-trivial limitations to social ontology. So we're pretty much interested into how far can we actually go with social ontology, with our theories, in terms of explaining what the world looks like, right? So by this we mean to say there are instances in social ontology, ontological theorizing, that eludes themselves from proper inquiry, right? So there are cases where we actually can't do anything, we can't say anything about the world we look at. And this has 3 reasons. That is either due to the semantic deficiencies, and that's where the language stuff comes in, of our natural language we use in order to formulate these theories, because social ontology is not formulated through like mathematics, as in the case of econometrics. We don't use formal languages, you use natural languages, right? But these natural languages have semantic deficiencies. They're not perfect, and because of that, our theories suffer in terms of precision. The second possibility, or second reason, is that the nature of social entities, things we talk about, actually themselves are vague. So we don't, you know, whatever we do, we cannot really fully comprehend them. Or, and that's the worst case, a mixture of both of them. Right? So we either have entities which are vague, which we don't really know, completely can explain, and at the same time our languages don't allow us to explain them in detail. Okay, So just a example that's coming from the standard literature, which talk about vagueness, are so-called Thuris's paradoxes. Right? It's a very simple thing, and it starts with this one. Right? This is in English it's a heap of sand. What's that in Spanish? How do you say it in Spanish?
Un montoncito.
Right? Right? So the question for us, obviously, in terms of definition, is like, when is a heap of sand a heap of sand, and when is it no longer a heap of sand? Right? And obviously you can throw in a standard induction here. So you say, okay, 1 million grains of sand, I have it in my hand, right, are a heap of sand, right? I've got like this thing in my hand, right? And I say 1 million grains are fine, right? Okay, so then I start an induction in order to find my borderline where it stops to be a heap of sand. So I say, okay, a heap of sand minus 1 grain of sand is still a heap. Right, so I take one away, I have 999,999 grains left, and I'm pretty sure you would all agree that's still a heap of sand. Right? I do my induction, n minus grains are still a heap of sand, but the problem is, if I continue, I will come to the conclusion that a single grain of sand is still a heap of sand. Right? That's classic induction for you, but you would say like, no, it's actually not. It's just a grain of sand. It's definitely not a heap. So the question is, when is it stopping to be a heap? And you can say, well, after 20,000. If you only have 20,000, then it's a heap of sand. But if you have 19,999, it's no longer a heap of sand. And I tell you why. And you say, don't know. Right? So this is what we call inquiry-resistant borderline cases, because we don't have a clear cutoff where we say this entity falls into our definition of a heap of sand, or the next one doesn't. Right? So this is kind of like physical stuff. So that's the standard. You know, there are plenty of these paradoxes flying around in the literature. This is the easiest one. So what I do, or what Anna and I do, is to take this idea and try to apply it to social ontology. One of the questions about social positions, for example, like the fact that I'm now a speaker, is the question of community acceptance. When does the community accept certain things and then create institutions out of it, or proper positions and so on, right? So basically my question is, it's a bit numerical, but obviously the question is, what is the critical mass if you have a community N, a larger bunch of people, to accept something being positioned as Y, so that X is positioned as Y is true in that particular community, right? So, I don't know, when do you have, I don't know, a community, and you position someone as leader of the community, when is that actually properly established, that position, and someone is actually a proper leader of the community, especially if you have informal communities. If you do it by law, like president here or something like this, you vote him in, perfect, everybody happy with that, good. But if you, do come together with a group of friends and you need to organize yourself as a small group, and someone needs to take the lead, when does the community actually accept you as a leader or something like this? So playing football and you say, I'm going to be the captain, and then everybody says yes, and some people, or everybody says no, right? In these cases, you are either positioned or you're not positioned as captain. But the interesting question is like, how much acceptance in the community is actually required in order to make something like community acceptance available. And where's the cutoff date? Where's the borderline case of community acceptance? That's kind of like what I'm trying to take this physical example to what's going on in society, or group acceptance communities. And so and I think this is how I can create a similar paradox in instances of these communities, and not just physical stuff like heaps of sand. So there are some implications as to how the main argument is actually that you cannot solve these problems, that you never be able to say exactly where the borderline is. That's the interesting thing about vagueness, that you can make a definition, but if you say, okay, a heap of sand is 20,000 grains, but then someone comes up and says like, well, hold on, 19,999, you kind of take it and leave it alone. So the actual thing is that a proper inquiry is not possible. As in other cases where you can actually delineate properly, like in mathematics. I think mathematics. Obviously you can prove me wrong with regards to Spanish, but mathematics so far is the only language or formal language which doesn't have inquiry-resistant borderline cases. English, it's certainly, I just gave you the example of the heap of sand, so English is total mess. I know for sure it's in German, but, my Spanish is not good enough to say. Spanish is also like that, has these kind of linguistic deficiencies. You can tell me later, yes or no. But yeah, so the problem is we cannot solve these borderline cases at all, never, right? However, we can kind of talk around it and try to explain why these cases are actually happening and still, find reasonable excuses, let's say. So in my paper, I go through a number of theories. I'll just tell you one of them. One of them is so-called super-evaluationism. Sounds very, 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 very complicated. But what we actually do is to take all these possible statements and look at in what context and when are they actually true or false, right? To say, a statement in the social ontological or social positioning of the form X is positioned as Y. Imko is now positioned as a seminar speaker. Can be either true, super true or super false, if it's admissible under every possible interpretation of that particular sentence, right? So Imko is positioned as a seminar speaker right now, is very likely to be properly true under any possible interpretation of that particular sentence, right? Mexico City is a city in Mexico is also very likely to be super true under any possible interpretations. Paris is a city in Mexico is certainly super false under any interpretations, right? However, I've been recently, last year, we've been to Lille, right? A lovely city in France. The sentence, Lille is a city in France, is actually not super true or not super false, because there's a small little part of that city which happens to be in Belgium, which I didn't know back then. So I made a completely mess out of that. And so other things like, a particular house somewhere off this scale at the border of the city, you could ask whether it's still part of Mexico City or not, right? So there might be cases where under a certain interpretation, a particular house might still be considered to be part of the city or might not. Right. So, and then obviously you ask questions about wider definitions of the city itself. So, supervaluationism allows us to talk about this, and there are instances where we have neither true or false, where we can't have a true-falsity gap, and these borderline cases are exactly that. Right. We cannot say whether or not this is true or false. The statement about this is true or false in any interpretation. We can use this theory of supervaluationism to at least explain away or explain why borderline cases are inquiry resistant, and we just say, this is the reason, take it and leave me alone with it. Right? And for those of you who are interested, supervaluationism wonderfully works also with different truth theories. So we don't only need to correspondence theory of truth, you can have different truth theories and works perfectly with them. So that is one particular way to use this stuff. Okay, so why should we care again? I know. I got this question all the time. Okay, so as I already shown with the case of the heap of sand, one reason why we should care is to, kind of like look at classic induction and the problems we have with that, and explain it away. The second one is because, that's a bit of a leap of faith for me, but you might agree that we are kind of like interested in conceptual precision. When we do research and theorizing and everything and so forth, it's not always possible, but we like to have it. To give you two examples, let's say on the right-hand side, this one, I've got a laser, so I need to use it once, right? So in mathematics, I said mathematics is perfectly fine. So a derivative of a function x with respect to x is a function, is kind of like a sign of that, right? So it's either that or it's not. Technically speaking, that is very, very precise in the definitions, right? We are conceptually very precise and know exactly what a derivative of a function is, right? Going to the left side, I stole it from Hopkins, and I have to be fair, he's being a bit more precise later on in that particular paper, but he says institutions are the kinds of structures that matter most in the social realm. They make up the stuff of social life. I'm not quite sure, but I wouldn't be happy with that in terms of having a proper, conceptual definition of institutions. As I said, he goes on later on in that paper, becomes a bit more precise, and I would say that in our attempt, to be good researchers and economists and whatever, we would like to go more to the right-hand side, rather than sticking to the left-hand side when we do our work. I'm not saying that we will ever get to the right-hand side, but at least we tend to be closer to that, hopefully. So we, when we try to go to the right-hand side, in our conceptual precision, we will encounter borderline cases, which will kind of like put a halt to our attempts. But we say, okay, it's fine, it happens, part of our language. Here's some theories which explains what is going on. That's basically the main argument. Okay, so what the second bit, so far we've just kind of looked at what's going on in terms of language, when we talk about it. But the obviously other thing is what if the world itself is vague? What does it mean? Vagueness is a feature of what? So a definition, a concrete object O is vague if and only O has borderline spatiotemporal paths, and B, there's no determinate fact of the matter about whether there are objects that are neither parts, borderline parts, or non-parts of O. The best and easiest example to take out of it is a cloud. Right? You can look at a cloud, you can look into the sky and see a nice cloud and say, this is a one cloud, right? You can zoom in, let's say we zoom in, and you zoom so far in to see individual water drops, patterns, which are part of the cloud. The question is, if you go to the border of the cloud, here it's fine. If you go here, and you see individual drops floating around, you can ask yourself, is it actually still part of the cloud or not? Our conceptual definition of the cloud may linguistically be perfect. No borderline cases whatsoever. But if you actually look at the physical thing floating around, you could sit there and say, is that particular drop actually still part of the cloud or not? And we can go even a bit further. It's a thing in philosophy, I forgot the author, theory of the many. Is that one thing, this one, is that actually one cloud, or does it consist of multiple clouds? It's just a combination of multiple clouds, And where's the physical border between cloud and non-cloud? That makes sense, right? So that would be an example of a actual physical appearance of vagueness in nature. which makes the whole thing a bit more complicated, because now we don't really know what the source of our vagueness is. You know, it's either in the world itself, or it's part of our language, or it's both, which makes it even worse, right? So yeah, but I have a nice little quote here. You know, the question of vagueness ultimately solves our representation of the things in themselves is a bit silly. You know, imagine you have sugar in sugar tongs, right? So if you want to grip like sugar cubes with your tongs, perfect works, you know. If you have powdered sugar and you grip it, it falls out. You know, who's to blame? Really, right? Is it language or the nature itself? So, you know, that's kind of like an excuse to try to ignore the possibility of that. But if we accept vagueness not only as a feature of our language, but also as a feature of reality itself, the whole thing becomes a bit more complicated in terms of, you know, saying where do we go, where do we stop, and what is going on actually when we start to talk about social reality. Okay, so that's the one paper. Now to quickly move on to the second one, ontological pluralism, which is even worse. So I have a couple of three central observations here. The first one is on the methodological level. If you read through the literature, there's quite a lot going on in terms of methodological pluralism. And those of you who were here 2 years ago when I did my presentation know what you know. There's a lot of things about, you know, methodological pluralism, and there are the classics in there, you know, Bruce Caldwell, Sheila Dow, and so on and so forth, and they all talk about, you know, pluralism on the methodological level is absolutely necessary, it's absolutely fine, it's perfect, we all should embrace it, right? So that's on the methodological level. So that's quite nice, and there's a lot to read about it. However, when it comes to the question of ontological pluralism, even epistemological pluralism, but specifically ontological pluralism, there's very little being written on that, right? In the same literature, the same people, right? So there are, and that's quite interesting because especially Sheila Dow and, as I said, Tony Lawson are very, very keen on writing about ontology in general, but there's nothing too little on ontological pluralism in their work. And thirdly, what has been written about it, I feel, is quite unsatisfactory and does not reach the depth and quality of the work which has been done in terms of methodological pluralism. Okay, so these are two existing definitions I have found in the literature. Pluralism on the ontological level involves the belief that reality constitutes a plurality of entities. In its pure form, ontological pluralism denies the existence of a unifying force of nature. That's what Sheila Dow wrote. The first one I'm not quite happy with. The second part, I have no idea what she's talking about. It makes no sense to me, right? So yeah, but who knows? Who cares? And then Tony Lawson, his 2009 book. It's a complete book about ontology, and he only denotes that much about ontological pluralism. So he says one conception is to say there are multiple non-overlapping worlds, right? Which kind of goes into this possible world idea and stuff like this. And the other one, again, is reality contains at least sort of chronically irreducible multiplicity of constituencies. Yeah, so that's kind of like the two conceptions of it. And I'm not quite happy with this definition. If you look at how this stuff is considered with regards to methodological pluralism. So here again is Dow, who said like the argument put by critical realists that a pluralist methodology is the best approach is apparently monist on the meta-methodological level. Why? Because pluralism at that level entails the recognition that there might be legitimately be other methodological approaches. But they basically say this one critical realist approach is the best one for methodological pluralism. And she says, like, well, hang on a minute, you know, there might be other ways actually, which are not specifically drawn from critical realism. So you should not consider that to be pluralist on the methodological level, because you just say, like, everything that is, you know, works with critical realism is good, and everything else is bad. You know, throw it away. But she says, like, actually, there might be legitimate approaches which are not necessarily based upon critical realism. And I take the same argument and throw it in ontological things, you know. So formulating ontological pluralism based on this critical realist open system ontology is nice, but it's equally inappropriate and kind of like excludes other ontological commitments, potential ontological commitments, right? There's more than just critical realism out there. Try to tell that Tony, but it's hard to convince him. So that's kind of like the way I try to formulate my argument. So here we got two things, and I specifically outline the critique of that. So the first one, ontological pluralism as conception of multiple non-overlapping worlds. What is my problem with that? Well, that smells a bit like David Lewis's possible world theory, which comes straight out of contemporary analytical philosophy. You know, it's nice, and I come back to it later, but I don't think, you know, sorry? But I don't think it really helps us that much in order to understand. You just say, okay, there are multiple worlds. Look at, you know, it's like, you know, multiple universes in physics. It's good that they have it, but, you know, so what? And the second one, I'll go a bit back, German classics. The problem is that explanation doesn't give us a so-called thick conception of ontology. It doesn't clarify the meaning of being itself, right? That's kind of like the second goal of it. The second one is, you know, many different irreducible multiplicity of constituencies. That likewise doesn't really deliver a thick conception of ontology. It's just basically telling you there's a long list of really complicated things out there, and I don't think that qualifies for a definition of ontological pluralism. In the same way that saying, oh, I am a methodological pluralist because my current model has 10 million different variables in it. You know, that doesn't qualify as a proper definition for methodological pluralism. And so saying that there's a long list of things in the world isn't really ontological pluralism. And also, I think neither of these two definitions are exclusive. So you can throw them together and say, okay, there's maybe just one world with many constituencies, or there are multiple possible worlds with only very simple constituencies, or there are multiple possible worlds with many complicated constituencies, and so there's no clear distinction between monism and pluralism anymore, because you can just throw these definitions together, and it makes it a bit more complicated. And maybe you feel better about it, but I don't really like it. So these are the two things I'm coming from. So what I want to do is trying to get a different definition, right? Going on the meta-ontological perspective in similar way Dow argues for the methodological pluralism, and my way is to do the following. What is a meta-ontological inquiry? First of all, again, we look at the language. We look at the semantics of ontological statements, and look at what are we actually saying when we say something exists, right? What is the linguistic function, or what are the linguistic functions? What's going on there when we talk about things existing, right? So there are various ways how you could potentially actually go and do this. One is standard classical discourse analysis, you know, how people talk to each other. And one way which I use is through modal logic. It's a more analytical approach to it, and I just chose that way. I have no reason why you can't defend it. And I also think this very much allows us to create a distinction, a proper distinction, or keep it up between monism and pluralism, and settle some ontological disputes. And I will give you an example of that in a moment. Two actually. But just to kind of like give you an example of what the thing is I'm going to talk about. So I'm back on talking about cheese, and I've been talking about cheese for ages. I love it. So the third one is, let us say, and this is from the literature, that there are different modes of being, ways of existence, or different ways to be something. That is the way I come from in order to talk about ontological pluralism. So I go away from this, multiple world versus multiple constituencies approach, and I look at the language and say, like, what is actually going on if we consider, there are multiple ways to exist, not just something exists or doesn't exist, but there are different varieties of existing or to be something. And the example Chris McDaniel puts out are the holes in the cheese, right? So he makes it quite intuitive. This is a very much intuitive argument. Say, well, we quantify over holes. We count them. We say there are some holes in the cheese. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 holes in the cheese. They are causally efficient. I can step into a hole in the street and sprain my ankle or hurt myself. So it seems that we very much believe in the existence of holes. So then kind of need to enjoy some kind of reality. But if you dig down what it actually is, you kind of like go, well, what are holes? I mean, they are actually the absence of something else. So we don't talk about them as absence of something else. We talk about them as being existent in themselves, right? So it's a very interesting way how we talk about it, right? So that's, again, I don't know how you talk about holes in Spanish, but certainly in English there's a very interesting way to talk about holes and all the other things. So McDaniel defines them as entities which only flourish in the partial absence of positive entities, right? So we can only have holes in something if there's something else, some positive entities or something solid where holes can be in. And based upon that, he defines this as a mode of being which he calls being by courtesy. So they can only exist if there's something else. They can exist as that, right? So a kind of mode of being that is purely defined negatively, right? So that's kind of like the starting point. We start to think about what is the mode of being here actually? How do they exist? And so the analytical conception about this whole thing goes through in language, goes through the concept of semantically primitive restrictive quantifier. And the concept of natural expression. So I'll quickly run through the definitions of what that is. So existential quantifiers are things in languages which we use in order to say something exists, right? There is a carpet. It's an existential claim. There's a table. These sentences there are existential quantifiers which allow us to say in a certain discourse that things exist and then can have properties. Unrestricted ones range over everything. They're supposedly unrestricted quantifiers in every language. It's kind of like hard to identify them. Some people say they don't exist, but we just take them as being there. But the more interesting for us are obviously the restricted ones, which range over the restricted domains. We're not necessarily aware of them, but they range over them and indicate which statements about entities are true. So if I say, for example, everything is on sale, I am speaking, I make the claim about the everything. This one exists and is a saleable object, but the range of that discourse is limited because I cannot sell the moon, for example, right? So the moon does not fall into that everything is on sale. And we have an intuitive understanding of it in these kind of discourses, right? So only saleable objects are actually, the statement is only true for saleable objects in that certain discourse. So the question is 5 minutes. Okay, so there are restrictive quantifiers. You know, it sounds like you know, we talk about everything, but we actually don't. And then primitive quantifiers are primitive by the virtue of the language we use them in. You know, so there might be a language out there which cannot talk about abstract entities. Okay, and naturalness is, you know, how do we carve up the world? Okay, so quickly going through what it actually implies. And two things are ontological disputes and possibilism and econometrics. Okay, so a classic ontological dispute is the Searle-Lawson disagreement about the existence of social objects. So John Searle is the second big name in social ontology, Berkeley group in the US, and if you read the stuff from the US, everybody's Searlean, and then Lawson in the UK. So Lawson is committed to the existence of social objects. Searle says, no, there are no social objects. They're just objects, but there's no notion of social objects. So they disagree on that. And what I basically say is, if we take on this definition of ontological pluralism and look at the linguistic, what's it called? The linguistic technicalities in there, we see that what we think is that they use a fundamental and unrestricted quantifier when they talk about things existing, but in reality both are actually using restricted quantifiers. So when they say things exist, they have a restricted discourse and they clash basically over not talking about the same discourse. Okay, the more interesting would be, I think for you maybe, is the question of possibilism and ontological pluralism. So I think that is not a bad statement to make, but economists like to talk about the world. So that basically means they do utter ontological statements. But we will not only experience explanations about how the world is at the moment, how the state of the economy is at the moment, but they also do forecasts. They talk about things how they could be, or they will be, right? So the question for us again is like, what is the existential status of these potential states of the economy? You know, are they the same? Are they ontologically equivalent to the actual form or not? And if not, how do we deal with that? So we either commit that they're all the same, you know, they're all the same, they have the same mode of being, which is intuitively a bit hard to take on, or we apply this type of ontological pluralism. Again, it's an intuitive, simple solution, and say the merely possible, these kind of forecasts, exist in a fundamentally different way than the actual state of the economy or any other kind of state, right? We still can commit to their existence, but we get away with this you know, uncomfortable feeling of equivalating them with any actual state, or, you know, like a table. A forecast and the table do not, you know, that's not the same intuitively. So if we throw ontological pluralism and say, well, there are different modes of existence, then we can perfectly happily say, yeah, forecasts do exist, you know. What's his name? Sherlock Holmes does exist. This table does exist, but they all have different types of existence. They're all different modes of existence, which kind of like, you know, at least solves this whole thing intuitively a bit better. And that's it. Done it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Imko. Ahora voy a pasarle la palabra a Josafat. Hasta 20 minutos.
Sí. Okay. Thank you very much, Monika, for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here to comment on the IMCO papers. Thank you very much for sharing the papers with me. They are very, very interesting. Before my comments, I would like to say that the CETRES, the Center for Complexity Science, where is the place where I'm doing my postdoc, is a place only for meetings. So most of the researchers are from different institutes of the university, and the key idea of the center is to have a place for interdisciplinary work. So there are like 6 different fields: complexity and health, complexity and biology, physical and complexity, and social complexity, arts and complexity, and so on. So it's a very new center. The center is very open, so it's highly interesting for this kind of interdisciplinary approach on economics and obesity and many other topics. So that's the Center for Complexity Sciences. First of all, I would like to say that for me the topic is a bit different for the kind of research I'm doing. Well, okay, I prepare something here. Okay, so first, I would like to say something about social ontology. The project of social ontology has to do with the work of a philosopher whose name is Roy Bhaskar. He's a very important thinker. He has a philosophical project that is the development of a new philosophy stance different from postmodernism and different from logical positivism. So in that sense, critical realism tries to be a kind of middle, in the middle of this approach. In that sense, social ontology is important because there are always ontological assumptions about reality, about what is causation, about the constitution of economic field. It has to do with the following question: is it possible to study economics using omission of social norms, making omission of the kind of psychology and social and power relationships, and so on and so on? In that sense, one of the key criticism of Tony Lawson to neoclassical economics has to do with the kind of ontological assumption that neoclassical economics are assuming. And this kind of method of ontological assumptions are very simplistic, according to Tony Lawson, because they are very simplistic, very deterministic. They are assuming a kind of closed system and so on. So in this sense, critical realism has to do with the new development of a social ontology. So in that sense, it's important to say that this is the context of social ontology. So I would like to say something about the first paper. I find very interesting the paper of vagueness, especially the idea of that the vagueness is a property of the word. I would like to know more about your view about the role of the context and how the context shapes shapes the ontology of different entities. I have in mind, for example, the example of Gestalt psychology, where you see a figure that sometimes is a rabbit and sometimes is a woman. Is this an example of vagueness? Does vagueness have something to do with cognitive biases and illusions? I would like to know more your view about that topic. Another example is when sometimes a sign seems to be a letter B, or sometimes it appears like a number 3. It depends on the signs that are around of the sign. In this case, I would like to know more about the context, how the context shapes the ontology of the sign. I think it's quite related with the notion of social positioning. For me, that's a very new idea because I haven't knew about that idea. So I would like to know more about your view about the context. How important is the context in shaping the ontology of the objects? Um, Also, I would like to know more about how you understand the word, the notion of the word, because sometimes I feel that it's quite similar to the notion of the double word of Nancy Cartwright. Nancy Cartwright is a philosopher of science. She is doing a kind of philosophy of economics and a kind of philosophy of physics. She says that the world is not something well ordered, but it's messy. It's something chaotic, irreducible to its fundamental parts. Cartwright is an anti-reductionist thinker. I wonder whether your philosophical stance is similar to Nancy Cartwright. And in that case, perhaps vagueness is a consequence of this ontological view, like the world as something messy, something disconnected, something that is irreducible to its fundamental parts. If vagueness is a property of the world, then a consequence is that knowledge perhaps is not something firm, is not something reliable. So it's fallible, especially in certain contexts. In this sense, I would like to know more how to avoid skepticism. Another important question is related with induction and generalization, especially in economics. For example, economic crises are phenomena very complex, with multiple causes and highly singular. Each case is different. Are the causes of economic crisis something vague, in the sense that they are it's not clear the borders. I think it's a very interesting case to analyze in order to see whether economic crisis has causes and whether we could develop a complete theory of this kind of very complex phenomena. And in this sense, I would like to know more about the role of theory, the relation between theory and modeling, and with vagueness. Okay, this is with your first paper. Your second paper about ontological pluralism. I find very interesting the idea that pluralism is not only a methodological stance that has to do with many methods. There is not only one method. Paul Feyerabend is a champion of this idea, the idea of proliferation, in his book of Against the Method. Pluralism also has been a kind of ethical and political and philosophical view on society. Recall, for example, John Stuart Mill and other liberal thinkers such as Habermas and John Rawls. But the topic of of ontological pluralism is something that has been little developed. The approach of Lawson, I think you are very right, requires more elaboration. In that sense, I think social, sorry, I put something very crazy here. Even myself, I didn't understand. Well, it's because I had a question about your notion of word, but I see that you are quoting Lewis, so it's very clear. But perhaps it would be better for students to explain more about what do you understand by the notion of word, and also the relation between word, pluralism, relativism, and realism. Perhaps that could be a good idea. Um, And for me, the most important, the part most interesting of your paper has to do with the notion of forecast and the example you provide about the Portuguese economy and how this has to do with the consequences of our current decision. So possible words are the consequences of our possible actions. In that sense, I would like to see more elaboration of that idea of how different models are the elaboration of different possibilities. For example, in some neoclassical models, there are some possibilities for policies. And in other models, there are no possibilities for certain kind of political economy, for certain policies. So, for example, according to neoliberalism, the government only will make more inflation when they apply more fiscal policies and more monetary policies. So in that sense, I think that there is a question about what is possible and what is not possible when there are some debates between macroeconomists and so on. So I think that's all my comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josafat. I have a question as well, and I'm going to ask the question before I give the word to the audience. So please prepare your questions because this is the final 30 seconds that you have. Well, actually, it's not properly a question; it's a requesting. I would like to request if you could explain in a much more ground level the connections and differences between methodological pluralism in economics, because I don't want you to reproduce the talk that you gave to us 2 years ago, but to at least bring to today the main aspects of methodological pluralism, and then the connections on socio-ontological pluralism. And if it's possible, if you can use the example of money and all the thinking and discussion about the nature of money, because knowing some of the students here, I know that it could be interesting if in this exercise of bringing all that you have talked to us in the ground level, using the money and the discussion on money, it could be a much more interesting hook to keep the attention. Okay. Thank you. Ahora es el momento, señores. Como quieran, ¿no? Es español, inglés, alemán. Aquí estamos aceptando todo. ¿Sí?
Do you want? That's too late. I already forgot half of the question. Yeah, I should have gone one before actually. But yeah. Just asked you to.
For the subject of pluralist economics, I think a pluralist view of ontological conceptions is important, right? For how it methodology is informed by ontology. The thing is, creating models and doing economics, doesn't it lead to a situation where people are just talking over each other? And where, like this debate in macro now, where we see heterodox people and orthodox people have discussions but never really get to conclusions because they're getting at the problem from a very different perspective. And then, where would that lead us?
Let's do this. there's something very similar to what you said about tackling the same issue from different angles, because I found, maybe this is not the proper place to think about like the connection, but I do see something very similar with religion, because I was having a conversation with a friend once precisely about the idea that even if some ideas, like someone who's not a believer like myself, considering to be a little bit fictional, the ideas of deities and stuff like that, there's also the idea that perhaps this sense of deities and, you know, their sacred norms, they also come from a place from these do exist, but like you said, in a different sort of reality, like another plane, but it interacts in our world, so it's do have some sense of existence, if only in essence, because it does influence the world, even if it's just like more like theoretical ideas, you know. So.
Okay. So I start with these two questions because they're fresh, and then I'll try to go to you. Okay. So yeah, as I said, I mean, the notion of ontological pluralism, what I'm trying to convey is that it will help to solve certain ontological disputes, or at least explain why they're there. And yes, people might talk past each other. You know, that's kind of like the notion of the Searle-Lawson debate, that that one is saying, yeah, social object exists, the other one says no. And I think in essence they talk past each other because they have different, you know, conceptions. I mean, the social ontologies of both of them are different, and also they, you know, in a closer look, they do this differently. When it comes to, you know, debates in macroeconomics in general, I mean, yeah, we might find that they talk past each other on an ontological level, but they might also just disagree on methodological terms, you know. So, you know, that's, I think, and also rhetorics, because was it Didier McCloskey wrote this lovely paper, the Rhetorics of Economics, where he basically says nobody really goes after the empirical stuff. They all just talk, you know, who has a better argument in terms of what sounds better. You know, so yeah, it doesn't solve all the problems, but yeah, they're there. So that's clearly clear thing. So the second question about norms. You know, I mean, I think that also goes a bit to Josafat's question about you know, the world and what I do understand and so on and so on. In a certain way, I'm very Wittgensteinian on that, and say, I mean, one of the underlying assumptions is that you cannot talk about something which you consider not to exist. Right? That's one of the key messages of Wittgenstein's treatise on philosophy. I forgot the name, what it's called again. The Philosophica Investigaciones. What was it again? What did Wittgenstein pay?
Tractatus? No.
The Tractatus, yeah, that's the one. Right? So, you know, famous quote, what cannot be said should not be talked about, something like this. You know, so yes, norms should have, or we need to commit to the existence of norms, whether or not religious ones or non-religious ones or whatever. You know, because we not only talk about them, but they actually make us act. Right? You act according to the norms you believe in. Right? So that is a very, very interesting thing to observe. And you cannot say, you know, they don't have any kind of existence. Whether or not they're different planes of reality, I'm not quite sure I would commit to that, but I'm happy to as I said, I would consider them to have some kind of existence. You know, the standard differentiation in philosophy is between abstract and concrete objects. You know, so there are concrete objects like this, and they exist, and there are abstract concepts like norms, ethics, you know, potentially mathematical objects. I mean, that's a whole different story, but it's there. I would definitely consider them to be existence and have a certain type of existence. Okay, so possible world. So where do we start? Nancy Cartwright. I remember Nancy Cartwright. So yes, I think it's very close to Cartwright's view in general, and also, you know, so the CSOC group, the Cambridge group, you know, I mean, Tony Lawson, who's kind of driving this thing, was a good friend and a friend of Roy Baskar's, and so it's a strong critical realist background in there, and he talks a lot about emergent properties of social entities and so on and so forth. So society and everything we look at is very much irreducible. You know, things like the corporation, you know, or the university or whatever, is not reducible to the individual components as human beings. You know, there are emergent properties of these communities and so on, which cannot be reduced to individual components, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so that's the thing. In terms of worlds, I mean, I'm happy to go. I mean, it's a bit critical, but I'm happy to go with Lewis's notion that possible worlds and the actual world, the only difference is between them is that the actual world is the one which we happen to live in right now. Although that obviously opens up some kind of criticism, but I think that's as far as I've been going with that yet, really. And then obviously the question of the possibilities. I mean, I haven't thought about it that far in terms of policies and, you know, what is certain like things like neoliberalism says it's possible or it's not possible, but I mean, from the ontological perspective again, and that comes back to the same question of norms, is, you know, if we develop these forecasts and so on, and develop basically ontological statements about possible states of the economy, right, and so on and so forth, then we are ontologically committed to their existence in one way or the other, I would say. And you know, but there's an intuitive problem with that. If we say they are the same, if we are ontologically honest, they are the same as anything else which exists. So it's kind of like an escape route in saying, like, you know, I feel bad about this, so, you know, this is kind of how I get rid of my feelings, the bad feelings about this, right? Yeah. So that. What else? What else do we have? The question of money. And maybe I can combine this again with, you know, a bit more on social ontology and so on, because you're interested in money? Yeah. Okay, so again, there also is a difference between like the Searle Lawson thing. So for John Searle, money is basically the piece of paper you have in your pocket, right? It's a thing. Which you know, he says an x function as a y in a context C, right? So this piece of paper he has in a, I wish he always does this in presentations. I've seen that. I don't have anything yet, but he says, like, you know, this is a piece of paper which is, you know, functions as money in a specific context. You know, if I had Mexican pesos in my hand right now, it's a Mexican. It only works as money in this country. Right, and he said that's basically it. There's nothing more to it, right? Lawson and the CSOC group is a bit is not happy with that. We say money is actually not the thing in your hand. That is an object or an artifact positioned as money, right? You can use whatever you want as long as the community accepts it. You can use whatever you want as money. Right? So in prisons, you have cigarettes as money, right? You don't have the Mexican pesos also. Outside of Mexico, the Mexican pesos is not considered by any type of community as money, right? You cannot. So what is actually money? Well, it is relational, according to the CSOC group, right? It is there to discharge a debt relationship between at least two parties. Right? If I go somewhere and I take, you know, if I go to the supermarket, I have just one nice one around the corner where I live, and I go there, take stuff out of the shelf, and I have a debt relationship between me and the supermarket. You know, I take stuff from them, they offer me, and they expect some kind of payment from me. Right? So that's the relationship we have. And money is a phenomena which allows to discharge this debt. Right? I could either work for the supermarket to get out, but to get the stuff I want. Right? That isn't really feasible in a complex society as today. So what do we have? We do have something, a phenomena, which allows us to discharge these debt relationships, saying like, okay, I owe you something for giving me that and that. Right? And that is very much, again, there comes the context, remember the context, that's very much context dependent. Right? So in terms of in terms of nation states, we have objects, pieces of very sophisticated paper with very nice drawings on them, and they allow us to discharge these debts. And you're obliged to accept this piece of paper as a means of payment, right? So it goes. The Cambridge conception goes much further in terms of its significance than the Searlean one, where he says like, oh, this piece of paper is money. Right? It's not. You can actually deposition different things as money. And sometimes, even if you have a legal tender, like the Mexican pesos and stuff like this, that doesn't necessarily mean that the community in which it is used in will actually accept it. Look at the Venezuelan pesos at the moment. It's absolutely worthless. You can use it to heat your house. To burn piles of money. The same with what it was called back in the days in Zaire or something like that.
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yeah, that's the one. Zimbabwe, right? Inflation. It was still technically legal tender, so it was still, supposed to provide the function of discharging debt on a legal basis, but nobody used it. The community did not accept it anymore because it would not function. It would not fully function in this capacity. So the Cambridge concept is a bit more complicated and looks at the relational situation between communities and what they actually do in order to solve these relational problems, I guess. So it's an interesting conception. I mean, you can take it on or not, but that's kind of like the way, at least we try to think about the nature of money. It's not just a piece of paper in your hand. It's actually the relational stuff, and also with regards to the rights and obligations you have with it, which comes with the use of money. As a citizen of this country, as a business person in this country, you are legally obliged to accept that piece of paper as means of discharging these debts you have. You can do other things, I mean, what did I forgot. One of the other countries. Where did I go? Dominican Republic. So they do have their own money, pesos, but if you're a tourist there, they are happy to accept the US dollar, right? In many tourist places, they usually accept at least one or two currencies, whether the local and so on. They're not legally obliged to do it, because the legal tender is the Dominican pesos or whatever it's called. But the people themselves, the community of businesses and tourist areas are happy to accept the US dollar as well as means of payment. It's not legal tender, but it's community accepted as means of discharging these debt relationships. So much about money. What else do we have? You want your notes back?
Something about ontological pluralism. Whether it is a kind of relativism or a kind of realism.
Gosh, that's a good question. I think, it's definitely not a relativism, a global relativism in terms of everything goes. But it is, I think it's context dependent. As well as social ontology, what we do in general is very much context dependent again. So I think it very much depends on the language spoken, and how the languages function actually, so not every language functions in the same way, and therefore the way we think about ontological pluralism in the sense that we use different quantifiers and so on, it's very much context dependent in the terms of the way languages are used, right? So I know best English and German, and it's very similar. Also historically, because these languages are historically related. But there are other languages in which certain things happen, which is quite interesting to observe. I don't know if I've kept that in that particular paper or not, but I definitely used it somewhere else. There is a Amazon tribe, the Piara Indians. I don't know if you heard about them. Linguistically, they're quite interesting because they don't have a concept of the past in their language, really, and so they're able to kind of like recall things that happened 2-3 days ago, but after that, it's just like something that once happened. So they don't have a complicated, complex way to construct the past linguistically. And the same is true for different languages. I think Thai is very, very simplistic in terms of how they construct the future, whereas you have other languages where you can construct the future quite complex. So in that sense, it's a bit relativistic, but it's like not everything goes. With regards to social ontology, again, this is very much, it's also context dependent, right? In how we create our conceptual schemes. One of the key questions we've been asking since I joined the group, which was about 5 years ago, and from all the participants, the question has been around for 200 years in that group, is that we have an artifact like a photocopier. Imagine a photocopier. We all know what a photocopier is, right? Now imagine the photocopier is transported on a ship, falls overboard in a storm, and is washed up on an island somewhere in the Pacific or something like this. And there's a tribe, been isolated forever. They've never seen another human being. And they find this and they put this thing down and use it as a table, right? So the question is that a photocopier used as a table, or is it just a table? It sounds silly, but that's been a question in terms of ontology. And I would say it is a table in the context of the tribe, because they have no conception of technology. Right? They have no conception of technology, they've never seen anything like this, so they cannot even comprehend what a photocopier is. Therefore, it is just a table for them. In our context, it is true to say it is a photocopier used as a table, right? But it's not true in their context. So again, it's very much dependent on the context in the situation. This is a very abstract thing, and thanks to globalization and everything, we are relatively on par with what we think and know what reality looks like, at least social reality. But there's still differences, right? For me, not necessarily for me, but in the UK, the head of state is the Queen. So she's the boss, more or less. Not really, she's just there. But here, it's just someone else. Right? It's just a person who happens to be very rich and mostly well-dressed. But, she doesn't play a role in this particular community. So again, this is kind of like context dependent. So for me, it's a person, a particular person who happened to be positioned as Queen of England after her mom died.
Dead.
Dead, her father, King George. After that, so she became queen, head of state, blah blah blah, in that context. But that's not true in the context of Mexico, because you don't have that monarchy here. There there was something on vagueness and also the question of the nature of vagueness. I mean, I'm mostly focusing on the linguistic bits. But yeah, if nature is vague and if social nature is vague,
something related with economic crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Because economic crisis seems to be a vague ontological.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can allocate vague states in there for sure, because the crisis is generally complex. So there's not just one single reason as to why it happened, right? Saying there are multiplicities of reasons which led to the crisis itself is not necessarily evidence of vagueness. But when you say, when you try to identify which one had what effect at what point, then you might come to the point of, it's not quite clear where one reason is predominant and the others are not less predominant, and so on and so forth. Right? So in that particular instance, you might find vague states, either due to the fact that we are linguistically not able to formulate them, or it is true that the phenomena of the crisis itself as a social phenomena is vague in itself. So so the application of vagueness is a very, very fine line. We're kind of looking at these borderline cases, and I think another example I've given in another talk was about intersectionality, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with intersectionality, is talk about roles in society and everything, and particularly mixed roles. What does it mean to be a black woman in the US versus what does it mean to be black in the US? So there are different categories, like being black, for instance. And then there's there's an intersectional one, which is black woman, right? Which kind of like made up or not of being black, being a woman, and you just throw them together, being a black woman. The question obviously is, where are the particular borderline cases in these things? So that's kind of like very complicated things, especially in sociology. And I think these are also these borderline cases are also inquiry resistant to a certain extent. And you can mix in more. What does it mean to be? When are you a black queer woman in a certain country or something like this? Once you start to develop these really complex social positions, what does it actually mean to be part of that group, non-part of that group, or kind of like borderline?
Other question? No, just showing. No. Okay, so any other question? Okay, so thank you very much, Imko. Thank you very much, Josafat. We are going to have Imko here until June, so please write to him, talk to him in the hallways, and he is very open and available for questioning and comments. Please let's get the experience of having him here a very pleasant one. So thank you very much for your assistance. See you soon, guys. Bye. Please.
Just say, one final thing, maybe you can write on that. I hope you found that interesting. And if you want, so at the moment, social ontology on this planet is mostly driven by the Berkeley group and the Cambridge group, right? So feel free to add a Mexican group and get some Latin American input into that discussion rather than just English and American, because that's getting a bit boring.
So this is the call. Thank you very much, Imko. Thank you all, and please another applause for our lecture. And have you all a good afternoon. Thank you very much.
No, es que
Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah. I was learning a lot because, well, I'm working in the topics on rationality. I'm working in the topics of behavioral economics, the topics on libertarian paternalism. So for me, your paper was very, very interesting in the sense that